Hello, I'm Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to TradeWinds, our new bi-weekly virtual event series where we will explore the future of global commerce in the era of a COVID-19 pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. Today, in our second episode, we will discuss the WTO in the post COVID 19 world, a very relevant topic to the future of global trade and investment. Clearly, the steps that governments take today to limit or to liberalize trade will shape our way out of the coronavirus crisis. To lead our discussion, I am delighted to welcome our two great speakers. First, Arancha González-Laya, Spain's Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union, and Cooperation. Arancha is former executive director at the International Trade Center in Geneva and former chief of staff in the WTO. Arancha brings a wealth of expertise to any and every trade discussion. And I also have to disclose that while holding the same last name as I do, she is not my cousin. Arancha is joined by Gary Hufbauer, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, who for more than 3 decades has been thinking and writing on trade, on investment, and tax issues. I learned from Gary since very early in my career, and I continue to do so to date. So, Minister Gonzalez and Gary, welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for being here with us at TradeWinds. Let me share a few details of our program. Minister González-Laya and Gary will deliver some initial remarks to frame our conversation, and we will then engage in a dialogue with all speakers. And I also hope to bring in some questions from the audience. So please get ready to submit them using the Q&A button in our platform. So let me say a few words to kick off the discussion. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic half a year ago, the WTO has witnessed no shortage of happenings. And let me highlight 6 of them. First, governments have unilaterally adopted a large number of trade measures. This includes 473 trade policy changes in sensitive food and medical products, medical sector more broadly, according to the Global Trade Alert. Some of these measures aim at facilitating access to critical supplies, including tariff elimination and expedited customs procedures. Unfortunately, governments also moved to restrict exports, putting most of the world without access to vital supplies at risk. Now, the good news is that in recent weeks, a growing number of export curbs that were adopted earlier have been removed or have lapsed. At the same time, however, the window of opportunity for keeping markets open for these essential items may be closing as more governments are also reversing their import reforms for these products. Second, the initial tendency to act alone is being complemented now by a number of trade initiatives to foster collective action to keep trade open. Singapore and New Zealand, for example, have put forward a plurilateral initiative on trade in essential goods for combating COVID-19, with other countries able to accede at any point. We heard from Canada's minister and ambassador last week that Canada has led a group of 23 WTO members into agreeing on a joint initiative to keep open and predictable trade in agri-food products. Switzerland, on behalf of more than 50 countries, has issued a strong statement urging concrete action aimed at facilitating cross-border flows of essential goods and services. And last but not least, the G20 trade ministers have also issued a number of statements on the topic. Third, the WTO Secretariat has stepped up to share information on the nature and projected impact of the pandemic and the measures to contain it. The Secretariat has put in place a system for countries to notify their trade policy actions related to COVID-19 and has come out with a number of sectoral papers to understand the effect of the pandemic on medical supplies, on trading services, on e-commerce, and others. It has also put out projections and alerted us to what is expected to be the collapse of trade flows across the world in 2020. And I am particularly appreciative of the reflections that Deputy Director General Alan Wolf has put out on the future of the system. Fourth, WTO members are debating how to continue operating in the new environment, exploring the possibility of digital tools to conduct normal WTO business, including negotiations. And not without some resistance, plurilateral virtual discussions about e-commerce rules will start next week. Fifth, 21 WTO members, led by the European Union, and including Brazil and China, have put in place an arrangement to settle trade disputes among them. This agreement, which has a mouthful name known as the Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arbitration Agreement, the MPIA, ensures that participating members will continue to benefit from a two-step dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO, while the appellate body remains paralyzed, including the availability of an independent and impartial appeal stage. And additional countries are welcome to join anytime. And six, in light of the resignation of Roberto Acevedo to the position of Director General as from August 31st, the WTO has started the process to renew its leadership, with governments to select a new Director General in the next few months. So while COVID-19 has brought to the forefront the need to fix WTO shortcomings to improve global cooperation, it is also bringing increased pressure for protectionism. And absent a concerted effort to rethink the future of the multilateral trading system, COVID-19 risks further debilitating an organization that was already suffering before the arrival of the pandemic, its most fundamental crisis since coming into existence 25 years ago. So let me now go to you, Minister González, and ask you, is the WTO still relevant? And in this complicated context in which we are right now, can the WTO be relevant in the future? So over to you, Arancha.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Peterson Institute, to you, Anabel, to Gary, for putting this very timely series of dialogues over international trade and gather the international community around them. We all know the figures. Trade is going to plummet in 2020. We are going to see a sharp decline in international tourism, which is another form of trade. We know that 1 in every 4 micro, small, and medium enterprise in developing countries is in danger of a permanent closure. We know the sharp drop in foreign direct investment, around 40% these years. We all know these figures, and we all know that progress that we've seen in the recent past will all of a sudden be lost to this pandemic called COVID and its impact on our economies. After every major crisis that the world has gone through in the 20th or on the 21st century, one of the shared responses has always been a return to multilateralism. It was the case after the Second World War. It was the case with the Bretton Woods institution. It was the case with the GATT, and it was the case with the launch of the G20, to name a few. Shared problems always brought this sense of shared solutions. And the recovery period that I hope we are entering into in the next few months will also require this sense of collective effort and collective commitment to engage. And frankly, the fate of the World Trade Organization will be no exception to that. I like to look at the WTO as a house that needs repairing. What do we do about this house that needs repairing? Do we knock this house down and begin constructing the house again? I would not encourage such avenue. The world after COVID will need much greater multilateralism in trade, more trade cooperation, and frankly, not less. It will need greater transparency, greater predictability, not less. It will need more opportunities to dig into the frontier issues like digital, like sustainable, like investment, like inclusive trade, and not less. Does this house need updating? Well, frankly, yes. Some of the rooms need complete retrofitting. Some of the old corner sofas need donating. The walls need painting and the plumbing needs updating. But some of the rooms in this house are in quite a good shape. They are fit for purpose, and all they would need is a bit of a dusting off and a little changing the light bulbs. In essence, I think this WTO, which is relevant and needed today, needs a bit of a course correction and a new map to get to where it needs to go. It does need some fundamental rethink to make it responsive and relevant for this new normal that we are moving into, but the solution is not to completely dismantle the system. It has to find a balance between honoring what it was initially created to do and being flexible enough to respond to current issues while also setting the stage for the areas of the future. And I'm saying this as the foreign minister of a country that relies heavily on open markets and international trade for its growth, and where 1 in every 4 jobs depend on international trade and investment. So I don't need to recap for this audience the main pillars of the World Trade Organization. There's thousands of pages written about that, but sometimes it bears repeating that the functions of this WTO are important today, whether it is to set and enforce rules for international trade, whether it's to provide a forum for dialogue, monitoring and negotiations of trade opening, whether it's to resolve trade disputes, whether it's to increase transparency over trade measures, as you've just mentioned, Anabel, or whether it is to cooperate with other international organizations in that many of these issues, and trade is a good example, links with many other dimensions of international life that require being put together in a coherent manner. I don't think we can question these functions of the World Trade Organization in 2020. The contours have changed. The world has certainly changed. There was no China when these functions were agreed by WTO members. There was no Russia. On the other extreme, or on the other part of the spectrum, there was no Cape Verde or Samoa. But today, the geopolitical landscape has changed, and we need to make sure that the WTO changes to adjust to it. Now, I'm not saying that the way to do this is to reassess the rules on special and differential treatment, or to move to plurilateral negotiations, or to strengthen rules on fair competition. But I'm saying that for the WTO to maintain, or to rather find again its relevance, it does have to at least recognize these challenging questions and start looking at ways to address them. So let me go back to my metaphor of the WTO as a rundown mansion. Member states are the architects, they are the financiers, they are the designers, they are the supervisors. It's true that the WTO has a secretariat, incredibly smart and talented people, and they are there to advise and to help and to support in implementation. But we know what happens, because we've done lots of renovation of our own houses. We know what happens when the architects, the financiers, and the designers don't see eye to eye. Unfinished rooms, cluttered vision, uneven steps, cheap plumbing. I mean, you get the picture. So member states must come together and reaffirm the place of the World Trade Organization for the future. that is in a way happening. We saw the recent G20 trade ministerial, for example, pledge to promote WTO reform and support the role of the multilateral trading system in promoting stability and predictability of international trade flows, while also understanding the need for the organization to explore COVID-19 related WTO initiatives to promote more open and resilient supply chains and expand production capacity and trade in things like pharmaceuticals, medical, and other health-related products. So in a nutshell, there is a clear recognition of two things. One, that the WTO needs reform, and two, that it remains relevant, to answer your question, Anabel, but not only relevant, also required. So this by means of an introduction, and obviously very much looking forward to listening to what Gary has to say and to engage in a dialogue after that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Arancha. I think a very clear message on from your side. So Gary, let me now bring you in. Do you think that the WTO is fit for purpose in the current context, and what would you say are its main challenges?
Oh, thank you very much, Anabel. And it's always great to hear from Arancha. I've known her for more than 20 years, and she is just, she brings a crystal clear view to the issues of the day, and really knows the backwards and forwards of international trade, the WTO, and other organizations. So it's a real pleasure to be on this program with Arancha. Whatever the outcome of the US presidential election in November 2020, the US-China Cold War will remain a fact of geopolitical and economic life, regrettably, but that's where we are. However, the US-Soviet Union Cold War of yesteryear, during most of my lifetime, both adversaries this time around are essentially market-oriented capitalist economies, and they are very large trading nations, US and China. So they share a common interest in facilitating global trade and investment, and with a small measure of goodwill, and I know there's not much of that right now, but with a small measure of goodwill, both the US and China can live together under the WTO tent, or in the framework of the WTO. But the WTO framework of the future must recognize not only differences between the US and China, but also, unfortunately, the general fragmentation among the 164 WTO members. The last truly multilateral agreement joined by all the WTO members was the Trade Facilitation Agreement of 2013, which Director General Acevedo brought to life. It was a very difficult negotiation, and he's to be commended for that agreement. But 2013 is 7 years ago now. The future of the WTO, in my view, lies in plurilateral accords initiated by like-minded members, but open to other members at times of their choosing and their readiness. And this is the route of negotiations now underway on fishery subsidies, on e-commerce, and most recently, as you mentioned, Anabel, the alternative dispute settlement agreement with about, I think, 25 WTO members out of the 164 members. And in the future, this plurilateral path could be, used for agreements on state-owned enterprises, industrial subsidies, technology transfer, climate change, those are all controversial issues, and one could not expect all 164 members to agree on them, but maybe groups, 20, 25, 40 members might agree on some of them. And that's good progress. That would be a good path to WTO. Now, meanwhile, in my view, the WTO must combat, four quite pernicious myths which are gaining currency in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and needed are factual studies by the research department, very strong research department in the WTO. And then once the research department does its work, the political leaders of the WTO can, bring the message to life and add color in their speeches and so forth. So the first myth is that global trade and investment promotes inequality, and that only rich people and big corporations benefit and everyone else loses. I mean, there's a widespread myth, but it is wrong on so many counts. Globalization has enabled hundreds of millions of people during my lifetime, poor people, to climb up the economic ladder. It's just been, the last 70 years have been some of the best 70 years in human history. And that's because of globalization. And it saves enormous time and resources not to have to reinvent the wheel, whether the wheel is the iPhone or the auto or any other technology device. It brings affordable food, clothing, household wares to lower income people in advanced countries. And this myth, which is so widespread, overlooks the real reason for lagging incomes of middle income households in advanced countries such as the United States or in Europe. And that main reason is that the jobs of today, of the 21st century, require high skills. And many people, unfortunately, have not acquired those skills in their education. And that needs to be addressed at home, but it's not a problem of globalization. The second myth, very popular today because of the COVID-19, is that supply chains, which are demonized as outsourcing, that they unnecessarily expose a country to shocks, such as the pandemic. Well, purveyors of this myth want us to make everything at home. Go back to a pretty isolated existence country by country. Never do these purveyors of the myth consider the alternative of stockpiling. If there's something that's really essential, you can stockpile it. And they don't consider the cost of cutting supply chains. And they don't explain why governments can do such a better job of assessing risks of supply chains than firms which understand all the details of the particular products or whatever. So this myth really needs to be combated, but unfortunately, it's grabbed hold of the public rhetoric in some countries, and unfortunately, here in the United States. The third myth, which is very popular in some academic circles, is that the scope of international trade and investment is somehow bumping up against the natural limit. I mean, this is ridiculous. We know, based on the density of trade and investment within large countries such as China or the United States or Germany, that the scope of international commerce, the scope of efficient, useful international commerce is less than half, less than a third of what it could be. That means that the work of the WTO isn't done. It's got a long ways to go to realize this scope for future generations. And the fourth and final myth which is in some circles a political truism, is that policy space, that phrase, policy space in quotation marks, is needed to ensure rapid economic development. And the people who advocate this myth basically are saying, for the most part, that developing countries should have all the freedom that they need to protect, to put in barriers to trade and investment as a path to development. And again, this is just a nonsense. We know that in the last 50 years, the developing countries which have done very well, Malaysia, Korea, Taiwan, Costa Rica, our host Anabel from Costa Rica, Chile, they've all been countries which have opened up, given up this so-called great advantage of policy space. So that's another unfortunate myth. And all these four myths are really working against what needs to be done now, which is to, as Arancha said, to engage more in international cooperation. The one area of policy space which is important right now in the wake of COVID is that when vaccines are invented and treatments are invented, that technology has to be made available freely to every country to produce those vaccines and treatments. And the companies that are pioneers need to be rewarded financially by their home governments, whether it be Switzerland or England or the United States or China. Let me stop there, Anabel, but thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gary. And I think by reminding us of this four myth, you somehow, put into focus the need to, to do more research, more evidence-based analysis to understand really, the benefits of global trade and investment. So both of you have talked about COVID-19 and the impact, of course, on the global economy. And you've mentioned the role of the WTO. So to start our conversation, let me maybe pose a question to you, Minister González, to start with. What would you think is sort of like an immediate WTO agenda related to COVID-19? And I want to take on the last point that Gary was mentioning about the relevance of making sure that vaccines and critical treatment can be available to everyone around the world when needed. A topic that, in my view, requires a lot of conversation now before the vaccine is out. But more broadly, what would you say is the sort of short-term, immediate WTO agenda related to COVID-19?
Thank you. Indeed, I agree with Gary that one of the areas where the WTO is going to be extremely relevant is around the issue of access to vaccine and treatment. Again, whether the rules that the WTO has for intellectual property rights are used with the flexibilities that have been agreed, are used and those flexibilities are understood by all members of the organization in the same way, could facilitate much needed access to vaccine and treatment, which at the end of the day will be what helps us go back to our old normality, not to a new one, but to the old one, with the security that we will not transmit the COVID to others. So there is one of the big areas is around access to vaccines and treatment, which has to do with rules on intellectual property right, but also has to do, for example, with e-services, whether it's e-medicine that some members of the organization have been putting, like India have been putting on the agenda, extremely relevant to ensure that e-services can help deliver the necessary medical care through digital means. Or dialogue of the members around innovation. Again, the vaccine and the treatment will come from a big drive to innovate. So one big area is around access to vaccines and treatment. The other one has to do with using fully monitoring of trade policies that the WTO has as one of its core functions and core tools. One of the things that small and medium enterprises are telling us here in Spain over and over again is the importance they attach to knowing what changes are being introduced in the trade rules or in the trade procedures, and monitoring of those trade policies, trade practices would be extremely helpful to help those operators in navigating the many changes in trade policies that have been introduced for a reason, very often to fight against COVID, but which have in a way made it more difficult for smaller operators to navigate international trade. So the second big area would be around monitoring of trade policies, and this is where I applaud the exercise that the WTO Secretariat has undertaken to sharpen the focus on monitoring. The third one, equally important, especially for smaller players and smaller traders, is access to trade finance. One of the consequences of this crisis has been difficulties in accessing liquidity, trade liquidity, that is, for businesses. And again, those that have suffered most, not to do a bit of a commercial, but there is very good research that the International Trade Center has done on access to finance for smaller players and for women-owned businesses. And we see how they suffer disproportionately in this crisis, like they suffered disproportionately in the 2008 crisis. So the WTO focusing a bit more attention into this issue of trade finance, activating the mechanisms that were put together in the 2008 crisis with regional development banks, with the International Chamber of Commerce, with private trade financiers, in order to facilitate access to the safest form of credit, which is trade credit, would be also extremely relevant in the middle of this crisis. So here's three examples, Anabel, to respond to your question of where the WTO remains immensely relevant, but needs to activate all these mechanisms to show to businesses that they have to care about what happens in the World Trade Organization.
Thank you very much, Arancha. And we have over 335 people with us, and we're getting questions from a number of them. So before going to Gary, let me just touch upon a topic that you mentioned, Arancha, which is the monitoring function of the WTO. We have a question here from Maria Sokolova. She wants to know, what can you say about the lack of notification to the WTO of measures that WTO members undertook in response to pandemic, and how can we motivate members to notify? And you pinpointed the relevance of this for business. So maybe you would like to elaborate a bit more on it.
Yeah, I think notifications, basically the system works on the basis of the goodwill of the members to share what they do with the rest of the membership. And what we have to do is go back to fostering this goodwill. The reason why members should be encouraged to notify is not because the WTO puts a policeman at the door to push them to do so, but because these notifications are extremely important for their businesses. And the smaller the business, the more important this notification becomes. So we should change a bit the mindset, in my view, not have this mindset of there is a policeman in the system, quote unquote, but rather the mindset should be, let's notify these measures. Frankly, we are in a crisis. Every member is taking those measures. They should not be ashamed of taking the measures, but they should be extremely transparent of the measures that are taken in order to facilitate the life of businesses that at the end of the day are the ones that will help us with their growth and job creation, exit the economic crisis that the pandemic has plunged all of us into.
Thank you very much. Gary, let me now come to you. to bring one of the questions that we have from our audience, from Sheila Page. And Sheila is asking, the WTO, along with the World Bank and the IMF, seems to have given up the convening and initiating role in international relations to groups like G20, G7. Is there any initiative which the WTO, possibly with the others, could suggest? Gary's mention of vaccines may suggest one area. Arancha also mentioned this point as well, but also Sheila mentions minimum levels of reflation or opening government markets under reflation to imports. So are there any topics that could actually sort of coalesce the international community around these very important issues? What do you think, Gary?
Well, thanks. I'll leave the IMF and the World Bank to one side and just concentrate on the WTO and pick up a point that Arancha made. She covered the waterfront so well, but let me just pick up on this question of vaccines and treatments. I mean, here the WTO could take the leadership, and it might be a small group of countries within the WTO, possibly led by the European Union, which would commit to making vaccines and treatments available to the world, both the technology and the actual physical medicines, the treatments and the vaccines, which will be made in hundreds of millions of copies in large areas like the European Union, and a commitment. Yes, of course, they will give first priority to Germans, to Spanish, to French, but not only that they will ship these key items in this terrible pandemic to the rest of the world in a decent number, and equally important, send the technicians and the experts to help facilities in those countries make those items. And that's really something the WTO could do kind of right now before we have the vaccines and treatments in hand. And let me say, China's trying to practice a kind of medical diplomacy, and I congratulate China for doing that, but China could certainly join in this because China may be the first to come up with effective treatment and
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary. I have to say that sitting in a developing country myself, this is, I think, an issue that it touches, it's very close to my heart and to many people around the world where, it is unlikely that the vaccine will be developed in some of these places, but of course, access will be needed in the same way as elsewhere. Now, I want to touch upon a topic, Gary, that you mentioned, which is, plurilateral agreements. We've heard about, from Arancha about some ideas. She mentioned, for instance, e-services as an area of interest. But the question is, how do we go about it? And I have 4 questions on this topic that I'm going to sort of put together. So the first one came from Charles Levy, who actually, thank you very much, Charles, because you sent it beforehand to us. And he says, with a consensus-based negotiating structure, 164 politicized members, and the opposition of China and India to fundamental change, how does the WTO negotiate the new agreements needed to keep it relevant? We also have Carlos Primo Braga, so asking, if plurilaterals are the way of the future for the WTO, can the system remain relevant if the US is not explicitly behind such a strategy? And Christopher Sands, can plurilateral agreements sustain the WTO without some kind of entente between the US and China? And finally, Gustavo Badilla, does the focus on plurilateral agreements to achieve progress on some issues pushes the organization to abandon the already deteriorated Doha agreement? So a number of questions around plurilaterals, great interest from our audience. What do you have to say to this, Gary?
Well, those are all great questions, and I'm so pleased that I recognized at least 3 of the names: Chuck Levy, a distinguished leader of thought and business groups for several decades, and Carlos Primo Braga and Chris Gans in their own respective areas. Well, I'm not saying that plurilateral agreements are the best, but I am saying that maybe for right now, they're the only way forward, at least for the time being. And yes, it will be smaller groups, and maybe eventually all countries will join in to some of them. If you look at the history of the Tokyo round with its codes, those were very plurilateral. Eventually, in the course of the Uruguay round, they were multilateralized, and that took 20 years or so. So that may be the path of the future. The question about the Doha round, the last question, is absolutely on point. I think we, the Doha round is dead. We just haven't had the funeral. But we have to recognize that the time has passed. Regrettably, the time has passed for the Doha round to be a template for moving ahead. There are subjects within the Doha round we might move ahead. One of them is services, which was mentioned, and that's a really big area. That's a dominant area of trade, which is riddled with barriers, and so much could be done on it, but again, in a plurilateral group. So I'm not saying it's the best thing since sliced bread, but it may be the only thing that we have in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gary. Arancha, let me go over to you because we have a question here that I think is very relevant, and I know that you worked in this area as well, which is from Amrita Bari. Amrita basically says, amid this rising nationalism and protectionism and the attack the WTO is facing, can we argue that WTO norms can boost economic growth in post-COVID-19 world by strengthening women empowerment? That is, by engaging the world's half workforce in this process of recovery. So what is your view on this, Arancha?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to, I want to link the answer to this question to one of the myths that Gary was talking about. And understand what the WTO can do and what the WTO cannot do. The WTO can make trade possible. That's what an organization that creates trade opening through reciprocal trade agreements and creates norms and monitors trade policies and adjudicates trade disputes. This is what the WTO can do. It can make trade possible. It opens opportunities. And it's very important in opening these opportunities that the WTO membership, which is at the end of the day, they are the ones that make trade possible, do this bearing in mind that the possibilities have to be open for everybody, for the large, for the medium, for the small, for the men, for the women, for the goods, for the services. So the larger the opportunities, the more you're giving options to your economy to build on where they have a comparative advantage. But countries should not stop there. They should make sure that these possibilities are translated into realities. So you still need to make trade not just possible, you need to make trade happen. And that is not the role of the World Trade Organization, fundamentally. This is the role of probably other areas of international economics and a lot of domestic policies that countries have to undertake. It's very good for WTO rules, for example, to have transparency, but you still need to make sure that there is access to credit for the small businesses, that they've got competitive products to offer in markets, that logistics are good, and so on and so forth. And again, this is not in the hands of WTO, this is in the hands largely of its members. And then you still have to make sure that you make trade work for all. And that, again, is another layer, another dimension where you've got to ensure that your tax policies, that your social safety nets, are those that your country requires to make sure that you leave nobody behind. So again, in a nutshell, part of this discussion has to do with the opportunities that WTO can create, but we should not stop there. At least in Spain, we are very clear we don't stop just at negotiating trade agreements. We are putting in place a host of domestic policies that will help our businesses thrive, including recover in the post-COVID world, using trade as one of the engines.
Thank you very much. And I guess this links exactly as you said with Gary's point about, for instance, the importance of developing skills in the context of the new of the current economy to actually make trade work for more people. Now, I have a number of questions, from different points about concern of, well, can we make the system work in the absence of agreement between the larger players? And we have, several questions from Alan Dearduff, from our colleague Jeff Schott, from our Professor Chin Kwan Tu, great to see you, from our colleague Doa Abdelmoutah, from Luca, who's also writing about this topic. And I guess the common thread around these questions is, so, and I'm going to read maybe Jeff's comments because I think that they somehow pick on the different elements that others have brought, which is, but the difficult for the major trading countries to compromise on areas where they differ in talks on digital trade, fishery subsidies, etc. So can the US, the EU, and China bend a bit for the sake of stronger multilateral solutions? And he says, seems hard to do in the current environment. But I would say, do we have a choice? So, Gary, do you want to come in?
Sure. Well, and that harks back to a question in the earlier round about, what can you do with the U.S. game? Well, if President Trump is reelected, the U.S. may very well be out of the game for another 4 years. Very unfortunate. But look at the bright side, look at the silver lining, look at that wonderful Singapore-New Zealand agreement on medical products, which was then joined by about 6 other countries. Look at this dispute settlement agreement amongst the 25 countries, the multilateral agreement that you mentioned, Anabel, without the U.S. Well, and it may be that the U.S. will be largely outside, but might be inside with respect to e-commerce. And I want to hark back to a point that Arancha made on the role of women and small business. The e-commerce just opens up the world for all sorts of small firms. Even here where I live in New Mexico these days, small firms are engaging in trade with the world through e-commerce. And it's just a wonderful device, and the US is pretty much on board on that. Okay, what about China on industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises? Well, maybe China will not accept any disciplines on those. Maybe the future in the next years is the US and China go head to head on those issues. Other countries might well agree on disciplines on state-owned enterprises and industrial subsidies. So, I know it's unfortunate that the big players are not together, not on the same page, but I'm very enthused that smaller players are taking the leadership in many of these areas.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gary. Arancha, let me just take it from here and ask you a question that Uri Dadush is posing, which is, what role can the EU play in reforming the WTO system? We have seen the EU very active, certainly with this interim arbitration arrangement mechanism, but other initiatives. So would you care to comment about this?
Well, the ambition of the European Union, certainly this is the view of Spain as a member of the European Union, the ambition of the EU is to foster international trade cooperation, to foster trade multilateralism, to foster and to strengthen the ability of the World Trade Organization to serve its members today in the 21st century in a context full of uncertainty, in a context where we are seeing big transformations on the way, including digital transformation, but not only, also a drive to decarbonize our economies with the challenge of inequalities growing in our societies. So the ambition of the European Union is basically to strengthen the ability of all of us to provide responses to these big transformations in a cooperative manner. Now, having said this, we also have to be aware that in this moment of uncertainty and in many respects conflict and transformation, we are going to require a lot of patience. We are going to require working with all our stakeholders. In the World Trade Organization, we've got incredible stakeholders. They are called businesses, they are called trade unions, they are called organizations that support many of the areas of our economy that are relevant. So we're going to have to invest in long-term thinking, in patience, in working with all stakeholders, and in finding relevant spaces where we can demonstrate that the organization can make a difference. So in a way, we have to think big, but we've got to start small to build trust and confidence that a world that is going through such a huge transformation desperately requires. Now, I know that I'm saying this, I've been on the other side, so I know that this is difficult to do. But in my view, those of us, and certainly Spain is a country that values cooperation a lot, those of us who believe in international cooperation as a way to manage this huge transformation and uncertainty in our economies, will continue to invest in multilateralism, for this very simple reason that it gives us a bit of an insurance policy to manage those transitions and these uncertainties better than the alternative.
Yeah. I think, thank you both very much for your comments. One area that I think is, you both have mentioned, and we've got several questions here that is important in terms of contributing to the growth in the future, is the digital economy. And here we have a question from Barbara Kochwar, who says, we seem to be seeing a rise in digital protectionism. What is the implication of this on countries' welfare, and is the WTO equipped to address this? And this more broadly with, do you see the area of e-commerce as one of those areas where members should be able to come together and deliver an agreement? Gary, what would you say to that?
Yeah, there's a lot of hope. If you look at the record of the last decade, since the great financial crisis to now the pandemic, merchandise trade did not grow very fast, did not grow faster than world GDP. Foreign direct investment flows actually fell, very unfortunate. But digital commerce has grown very rapidly at rates like 20% a year. So this is growing. Now, as Barbara Kochwar rightly pointed out, there's also digital protectionism, and it's impeding, but fortunately the technology is still ahead of the protectionist instincts. There are local content rules, there are disagreements over privacy, there are tax issues, there are source code issues. All these are hindrances, but there are areas of agreement, and I think the WTO the e-commerce group can at least agree on some basic things, like not having fraudulent, you know, wares on the internet, having acceptance of electronic signatures, having issues about liability. Maybe these second level but important issues can be resolved within the WTO framework, and that's a good step forward, even though we disagree on, for example, local content requirements, which are creating a lot of friction in the digital space. But I think the outlook is on the whole pretty optimistic.
Thank you, Gary. Arancha, your views on the role of e-commerce to help us recover from COVID-19.
Well, if you want an example of a newly discovered area during this COVID, it's been the digital space. I mean, from electronic payments to shopping online to cross-border education, frankly, to video diplomacy. I mean, I don't know what I would have done without access to this digital system in which we can connect with each other. We have discovered the immense opportunities offered by this digital world. But we have also discovered the importance, as Gary was saying, to discipline a little bit better some of these areas. So to me, this is a very good example of an area where the World Trade Organization has its job cut out for it, and where the members of the organization would do well in investing effort, patience, and long-term thinking to provide disciplines in the space of digital. And again, it's e-commerce, where there is already a group of WTO members negotiating rules, but it's well beyond that. If I look at the area of e-services, it's an incredible opportunity that requires a lot of thought and action on the side of the members in the World Trade Organization.
All right, thank you very much to both you, Arancha, and Gary. I have to say that time flies when you're having a great conversation, and unfortunately, we're reaching the end of this episode of Trade Winds. But I am very grateful to both of you for sharing with us your views on so many important topics in this context of global cooperation and COVID-19. I also want to thank our audience. You sent us over 50 questions, and we will not be able to unpack all of them in one episode of Trade Winds, but we sure will take note of them, and we'll continue to discuss these issues in next episodes of Trade Winds. So I want to thank again Gary and Arancha, our audience. I also want to thank Steve Weissman and all my colleagues at the Peterson Institute, Jessica, Yvonne, Matt, Rebecca, Anjali, William, Helen, and everybody else who has put a lot of work into making Trade Winds happen. To you in the audience, send us your comments and suggestions on topics and guests. And please make sure to share with your friends the news that we have, as I was saying in the previous episode, a new webinar in town, which is Trade Winds. Stay tuned for our next episode. I am delighted to host former World Bank President Robert Selleck and former WTO Director General Pascal Lamy on a very interesting conversation on the future of the multilateral trading system next Wednesday, June 17, at the same time. Thank you very much again to all, and great to have you in this conversation at Trade Winds. Thank you. Goodbye.